Brace yourself. Gonna blast up anytime now. Collect yourself. Things will never be the same in a sad, sad world. Walk around the light a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. When I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So slip back in your hole.
Okay, welcome everybody. Good to be with you today. Today we're going to make the transition. We've been looking at China, and now we're making the transition from China to India. Just notice there's a cord here, so watch as you walk over. We're making the transition from China to India. In our class, we will do the two Khan Academy World History lessons, Ancient India, immediately followed by Empires of India, and we'll do them in that order, even though on Khan Academy they're separated. We did the same thing with China. I want to lay just a little bit of background for you to make your experience of watching and reading about India and learning about India a little more fruitful and a little clearer. And to do that, I first want to go back. I want to go back to a conversation we had several months ago, back in the Bob Bain days of this class. We've got three terms here on the board. They're related but not identical terms. We talked about them. We looked at this actual slide 3 or 4 months ago. Terms are population, culture, and civilization. They're related, but they don't mean exactly the same thing. Who wants to tell me what population is? Population. Your voice will be heard, but the only thing on video is the slide, so your anonymity is safe. No one will know who you are, Miguel Salas. What is population?
The people that live in some place.
Yes, the people that live in a place. All right, that population is straightforward. The people that live in a place. What is culture? What does culture mean to you, Adrian?
That's a good question.
Lots of ways to answer that.
I guess to me it would be the practices, or just practices of a certain community.
Practices of a certain community. I like that. Derek, you want to add something to that?
Yeah. It could either be practice, perspective, or I forgot the other word for it. Or like something like a tradition, basically.
Practice, perspective, tradition. So there's no one way to define it. Here's how I describe it. So it's the religions. I start with religions because the root word of culture is cultus, the Latin word for religious worship. Religions, languages, customs, rules, arts, knowledge, and collective identities and memories developed by members of all social groups that make their social environments meaningful. Culture is all the stuff that makes us uniquely human. From the gods we worship, to the songs we sing, to the food we cook. Different cultures have very unique cuisines, right? I am incredibly privileged in that I happen to live, I think I've told you this, if I told you all about the food trucks. Yeah, so I'm telling you again, I live right next door to 5 food trucks. There's Jamaican, there's Puerto Rican, there's Venezuelan, there is Mexican, and like a fruit salad place. So I've got a little mini United Nations just in the gas station parking lot right next door to me, which is why my gut continues to grow while my bank account continues to shrink. Because food trucks, they call it street food. You living in the street, you can't afford that food. Population, culture. Are there any people that don't have, well, there aren't going to be people that don't have population, because population is people. Are there any people that don't have culture? No, no. Every community, every community has culture. There is nobody. Oh, so okay. An infant is born, brain damaged and dies when he's 3 days old. That's a human person that has no connection to culture. But even that unfortunate soul comes from a culture. There are no peoples that don't have cultures. What about civilization? Is civilization the same as culture? Does everybody have civilization? What do you think? What's civilization mean to you? Civilization. Derek, you look like you want to say something.
I'm thinking, but I guess the people of like a country, state, island, or stuff like that.
And
Say the same people that share the same culture.
okay, so it's people that share the same culture, but there's a little more to it than that. It's why civilization and culture aren't the same thing. Here's traditionally how civilization has been defined. Civilization is a complex society with 5 characteristics: advanced cities, specialized workers, complex institutions, record keeping, and you can read that to mean writing, and advanced technology. By this definition, every people have culture, but not every people have civilization. Civilization is one way of doing culture. The root word of civilization is the Latin word civitas, which means city. All right. So when we talk back in the day about the beginnings of civilization, and we looked at Sumer, we looked at Egypt, we looked at the Fertile Crescent, that's not the beginning of culture. Beginning of culture goes back 250,000 years. That's the beginning of humankind. But civilization is a specific way of doing culture. And I just want to acknowledge for you that this term civilization is not without some problems. It's a category we've really been using for about 200 years. All right? And it's a way of describing and understanding other people's cultures that came out of scholars from a European or an American background. And there are some people who object that this category treats those cultures that are organized kind of like Europe and America. Those are the higher, more advanced cultures. And the cultures that are organized differently, well, they're still primitive. They're lacking something. As if the way we've structured our society is the default setting for how a society should be, and we judge other cultures by that standard. There's some real truth to that objection, especially when you look back at the 1800s and early 20th century, where a lot of the founders of history as a discipline, the way it's done today, were upfront, overt, not pretending, not hiding anything, white supremacists. All right? A lot of the categories we use in academic disciplines come from people who genuinely thought our people are the best people, our civilization the best, and yours, whoever they're pointing at, I'm not pointing at anyone in particular, can't see it on the video, but there's a baby Yoda, that's all I'm pointing at. And baby Yoda's, well, he's not a white dude, so his way of doing culture is inferior. I think we need to recognize that that's where some of these concepts come from, but I think we also need to say, just because the motivation behind a concept is flawed doesn't eliminate the usefulness of the concept automatically. It's not the case that having a complex city-based culture makes one people better than another. It's not even necessarily the case that that's the best way to do culture. Remember when we introduced this and we were still listening to Bob Bain and we talked about how when agriculture and then civilization were first developed, it actually made life worse for people? There's nothing automatically better about civilization. Nonetheless, it's a very different way of doing culture than hunting and gathering is. And though the people who have civilization are not better people, it is better to be able to read than not. As historians, so my forebearers as professional historians were wrong to exclude more traditional ways of knowing and oral culture and the things that non-European people did to generate knowledge. But to be able to read is still better than to not be able to read. Advanced technology, to have air conditioning is still better than to not have air conditioning. To be vaccinated is still better than to not be vaccinated. The people who are vaccinated are not better than the people who aren't. The people with air conditioning are not better than the people without. The people who can read are not better than the people who can't. Most of the time, they're just luckier. They're just born with access to different resources. Nevertheless, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, which is why we move now not to any random culture on Earth, but specifically to India. Civilization, this sort of advanced city-centered way of doing culture, emerged independently in 6 different places, 6 different times in history. We've spent most of this course looking at the early history of Western civilization. The ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. Europeans were not early on to play the civilization game. Other cultures had developed advanced civilizations while Europeans were still digging for worms in the dirt with sticks. European civilization is really seeded from these 2 places, Sumer in modern-day Iraq and Egypt, and spread throughout Europe and then eventually throughout the Americas with European colonization through that line. China developed civilization independently, and so did the Indus Valley in what today we call India. In fact, this region that we're looking at straddles the border between what today are called India and Pakistan, though Pakistan's existence as an independent nation only happened in the 20th century. So though they're 2 very different countries now, and they don't always get along very well, they do have a common historical background, and that's what we're looking at. So, in your Ancient India videos on Khan Academy, you're first going to look at the earliest, not the earliest people in India. That goes back tens of thousands of years. You're going to look at the earliest civilization of India. It's a group we call the Harappan civilization, because as Sal Khan will explain to you, one of the 2 main centers of this civilization have been discovered in the city of Harappa and the other in the city of Mohenjo-Daro. We don't know what they called themselves because even though they left plenty of writing, nobody knows what their language was. Nobody has yet been able to decipher the language of the Harappan civilization. But what we can find through archaeology is that, and I didn't say out loud, but that as much as 5,000 years ago, you had a very advanced high culture civilization in India, Pakistan. Here are some ruins of these cities, and as here, the cities are very well planned out, and which may serve as evidence that there was some sort of established government in these cities. What do you think the connection there is? Why would a well-planned out city serve as evidence that there was a government? What do the 2 have to do with each other? Mayors don't pave the streets and plan the cities. Why would a well-planned city be evidence that there was government? What do you think? Isabel, any thoughts? What's the connection? Oh, she's going, no. Amanda Blanco, what are your thoughts? Come here. Come here. It's Amanda Blanco, ladies and gentlemen. Any thoughts?
Maybe that since everything had to be planned out, then there was supposed to be like a higher power or something.
Yeah, so watch this, all right? Here, no, Amanda, come sit down. So, let's say I get up at the beginning of the class and I say, okay, class, here's what you're doing. You're going to learn all about ancient and medieval India. And you're going to come up with a class-wide project about ancient and medieval India. And then I go to sleep at my desk. That's all the instructions I've given you. What's going to happen most likely? Juvie, come say that. Here comes Juvie. You know, they threw her in the garbage. She went down to the office and they made her sit in the garbage. What's going to happen, Juvie?
We all gonna fail.
That's a real possibility, because I've kind of done you a disservice, haven't I? If I'm just like, hey, learn about India and don't give me any instruction. One of three things are going to happen. Possibility one, total chaos and nothing gets accomplished and everybody fails. Possibility two, some people step up and take leadership and nobody does what they say and everybody fails. Or people step up and take leadership and then coordinate, and then you begin to make a complex project, and then everybody succeeds. Governments aren't perfect. Most of a history class is about all the people that this government killed versus all the people that government killed. But you kind of need them to have a complex civilization like the Harappans of ancient India. This statue here is considered by many, perhaps this is a king, but because we can't read their writing, maybe it's a god. Maybe it's just a dude. Who knows? Because we don't have, we can't read their writing. Some more Harappan ruins. The cities, they had roads built in this grid pattern. They were built on hills. They had brick homes. They had plumbing and sewers. Plumbing and sewers, 5,000 years ago. This is a beautiful site, even in ruins, a great bath of Mohenjo-Daro. And they have the oldest toilets ever discovered in the world. Does that look like something you'd want to sit on, Brian? Brian says, yeah. I mean, they've got to be for sit. Well, I won't explain why, but it'd be hard to aim at that. I'm saying too much. Didn't find, we've got all this technology. I don't mean computers and stuff, but for 5,000 years ago, toilets are advanced technology. Writing is advanced technology for 5,000 years ago. We haven't found a lot of weapons, which makes historians suspect. Again, we got to suspect because we can't read what they wrote, because we're all illiterate when it comes to the Harappan language. But it makes us suspect that they were probably a more peaceful people. And though everyone wants to be more peaceful, it's a lot easier to be more peaceful if you just ain't got a lot of enemies around you. And if you're so much more advanced, we've talked about why that term advanced might be problematic, but we're just talking here. If you're so much that more advanced than your neighbors, well, then maybe nobody's a threat to you. Here's some more artifacts. Man, you want somebody digging you up 5,000 years later and seeing what they buried you with, Amanda Blanco?
No.
Yeah. They can do whatever they want. Honestly, you can throw me in the dumpster when I kick off, but I'm dead. What do I care? I mean, if anybody wants my organs, if anybody's in such bad shape that my organs are better than yours, you can have them. Hell, I'll cut out a couple of kidneys right now. But the Harappans are the first we have evidence for growing cotton to use as cloth. And we have evidence that there were networks of trade extending miles and miles away. So in an age before mass communication, they were still in contact and in communication with many other peoples around the world. And yet their civilization declined, disappeared around 1900 BC for reasons that we don't understand. Maybe it was flood, maybe it was earthquake, maybe it was invaders. And this sure didn't help. Around 1800 BC, another nationality, another ethnic group, the Aryans, moved in. The Aryans are an Indo-European group. Indo-Europeans, you go back 6,000-7,000 years ago, they come from here, sort of the border of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and they turn out to be common cultural ancestors of people that don't seem like they have a lot in common. The Indo-Europeans, as they migrated in different directions, they became the Greeks, and they became the Italians, and they became the Norse, and they became the Germans and the Anglo-Saxons. They became the Iranians. Iran and Aryan are really the same term. And they became the people of India, who don't, at first glance, seem to have a lot to do with, or have much in common with the Greeks. If we can't read their writing, and their cultures seem so different, they don't look very much alike. The typical person from India does not look like the typical person from Norway, but we're saying that they have common roots. How do we know this? So, the second India video on Khan Academy is likely to confuse some people if you don't know what it's talking about. The second India video on Khan Academy is talking about how we discovered that the language of ancient India, Sanskrit, and the Greek language, and like almost all the other languages of Europe, are related and come from a common source, which is how we figured out that the people are related and come from a common source. So, writing is a pretty new development in human history. But there's a discipline known as linguistics. Linguists can analyze language and find hidden primary source evidence of things that occurred thousands and thousands of years before anybody ever wrote anything down. And so all I want to do with the last few minutes I'm talking to you today is illustrate how this works. So let's say I were to say this. I say, y'all go ahead and eat and talk about chinche. I'm fixing to watch the Bears game. And let's say 1,000 years from now, a linguist hears that I said that, and he's trying to figure out who I am. The first thing that would jump out at the linguist is the word bochinche. And the linguist would say, wait a minute, now there's a Spanish word in the middle of an otherwise English sentence that doesn't sound like it's said by a native Spanish speaker. In fact, it's not just any Spanish word, but it's Puerto Rican slang. So the first thing the linguist would do, he'd look at this sentence and he'd say, this must be a native English speaker who spends a lot of time around Puerto Rican people. By looking at this one sentence, this linguist would have discovered that much about me. Who am I? I'm a white American school teacher at a school with a large Puerto Rican population. And I love the word bochinche. So the linguist has already discovered that about me. Then the linguist would look at this. Y'all and fixin' to. Well, that is English, but they don't say y'all and fixin' to in England or Minnesota or in most places where they speak English. So the linguist would be able to see that, this person has some connection to the region of the U.S. known as the Mid-South, a place where those terms are common. Fact is, I wasn't born in the Mid-South. I was born in Illinois, and so was my dad. My grandfather came from Mississippi. I spent a ton of time around my grandfather growing up, so much so that y'all and fixin' to, without irony, are part of my language. The linguist would have discovered that from these two sentences. Then the linguist would turn to, I'm fixing to watch the Bears game. All right? So the linguist would see there evidence that I come from the Chicago area. Not just because the Bears are a Chicago team, but in the particular way that I pronounce the Bears. Now, my accent, if you ever wondered what my accent is, it's not very thick, but it's a Chicago accent. And one of the hallmarks of the Chicago accent is that the TH sound in the word the is pronounced more like a D. Duh. And the S at the end of bears, I don't say like a Z, bears. I say like an S as in sauce, the Bears. Now, my accent isn't thick. If it were, I'd be talking about the Bears. That's my accent unleashed in its natural habitat. from these two sentences, a linguist would be able to reconstruct my ancestry, be able to reconstruct where my family came from generations before I was born, be able to reconstruct where I grew up, and be able to reconstruct where I live as an adult. This is the tomb of my great-great-great-grandfather, James E. Childers, born in 1772, died in 1854 in Ripley, Mississippi. There's evidence of him in my DNA if you know how to decode it, but there is evidence of this man about whom I know very little. I never met him. Can you believe there are people older than me? I wasn't around in 1854. But there is primary source evidence of this man and his life in every word I speak. And we've only looked at 2 sentences. What linguists do is they look at language and they find the patterns of how language changes over years and centuries and millennia. So, I'm fixing to watch the Bears game. Obviously, the earliest version of this is I'm going to watch the Bears game. And then in the South, they replaced Mid-South of the U.S., they replaced going to with fixing to. Why? Who knows? But fixing to is actually the more literal way of explaining it. Going to the normal way, supposedly, is more poetic. It's a metaphor. Go, that's a destination. All right? Fixing means to make or prepare. I'm fixing dinner. So the Mid-South way of saying it is more literal. And so the Southerners replaced the poetic, going to, as in watching a game as a destination, with the more literal. Then the next phase was to drop the G. That's common. Fixing became fix-in. Is that the end of the evolution of this phrase? What comes next? So it's the end of the evolution of this phrase for me, because that's how I speak. But language continues to evolve. What comes next in the evolution of this phrase? What's the next step from going to fixing to fixing to
Finna.
Yeah. And in fact, funna is probably the stage after next, because first it was finna. I'm finna watch a Bears game, which sounds odd coming from me. That's not the way I speak. But it's in direct line of descent from fixing to, and from finna to funna? Yeah, finna? Okay. So what's finna mean? Well, it comes from African American dialect of English. Why does African American dialect have so much in common with the Mid-South? Ask your U.S. history teacher if they're still allowed to tell you in Florida. Language changes so quickly that you and I, who are separated by 30 or less years, right? I think the youngest person in the room was probably born in 2009, right? Anybody born in 2010? All right. So the youngest person in the room and I are separated by 30 years, not 3,000 years. And many languages are represented here, but we can all generally speak at least one language in common, English, and yet we can't always understand each other. A few years ago, I posted a video. Before Schoology, we used Edmodo, and I posted a video for my students. And believe it or not, Aya, can you believe that the video I posted was kind of long? That I talked for a long time? And one of my students posted a comment. She said, "Say less." And I interpreted that literally. And so I made this post on my Facebook. Perfectly reasonable student feedback on my latest video, which was longer than usual. I thought she was telling me to say less because the video was so long. And instead she was saying, like, I got you, I'll help you with whatever I was talking about in the video. It took our former teacher, Miss Arajo, she's been gone a year, so some of you know her, remember her, right? It took Miss Arajo, who's probably 10, 15 years younger than me, to translate English to English for me. It's like, no, she wasn't telling you to say less. She was offering to help. When I made this slide 3 years ago, the words on the screen were words that almost all my students said every day. And my point 3 years ago, look at Leandro's face. My point 3 years ago was only 25 years separate us, and yet You already use all these words that I barely understand and that I can't use. I would sound ridiculous. 3 years later, most of these words sound ridiculous to you now, right? Haven't most of these dropped out of day-to-day conversation? Do people still say yeet and vibe? No. People still say bussin'? No. There was a video circulating of me a few years ago. One of my students took it, and they're like, "Hey, say something." They wanted me to use the word bussin', and so I grabbed. There was a cheese stick, and I'm like, "Hey, I got some bustin' cheese sticks here," because I'm stupid and old. Yeah. So that's how quickly language changes. What linguists do is they trace the changes, and then they project those patterns back in time so that they can discover otherwise lost information. In the case of India, you'll be watching Sal Khan's video about Sanskrit and Greek being having a common language, and then you'll move on. I'm almost done. You'll live, and then you'll move on. You'll hear about what he calls what historians call the Vedic age, and he will explain to you what that means. Basically, the new group, the Aryans or the Indo-Europeans, they came in, yes. They took over and became dominant, yes. But you shouldn't picture this as a genocide. It wasn't like North America, where we came in and wiped out almost all of the native people. It was more like South America, where the Aryans came in and they dominated. Their language became the language. Their customs became the customs. Many people died, and yet the native cultures of Central America, South America, the Caribbean live on. They blended instead of wiping them out. Okay, so here's what I want you to do over the next couple of days here in my class. There are 2 Khan Academy lessons of India. First, do the ancient India lesson and have that done by the end of the day tomorrow, and then move on to the empires in India lesson. That's all I need from you for today. Many of the visuals in this PowerPoint, not the linguistic stuff, but the historical stuff, came from a teacher named Jeffry Smith, who operates under the name The History Shop. That's all I need from you for today. Rest of time is yours.
Walk around a lot a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million bits and pieces. What I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So sit back in your hole, or get back in your cave. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with